Okay, good morning and good evening to all, and welcome to the Data-Driven Community virtual meeting. My name is Ronen Arieli, and I am honored to host this meeting today. The Data-Driven Community manages two branches, a weekly meeting of the Cloud Data-Driven User Group, like today, and an annual conference called Future Data Driven Summit. At our next user group meeting on May 11, we will host Kevin Fessel, and we will discuss the topic of data exploration with Synapse and KQL. News: the registration for the Future Data-Driven Summit 2023 has opened, and you are welcome to register. The event itself is on 27 on September. We are still finalizing the agenda. If you are interested in speaking at the conference, you can submit your session proposal this month. So do it fast, so we will be able to move to the next step of organizing the event. Today we are hosting Andy Cutler. Andy is an independent business intelligence consultant and expert in Azure Synapse Analytics, Data Factory, SQL Server, and Power BI. And obviously, Andy is also Microsoft Data Platform MVP. So, Andy, you are welcome to share your screen and take the control.
Thanks very much, Ronan. Thank you. Let me just get myself set up here. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
And can you see my screen?
We see your screen, we hear you, and it is recording.
Brilliant. That's all we need. Yeah, so as I said, anything, any questions relevant, just drop them in the chat. I'm quite keen if there are questions to answer them, as I go through. It's not going to particularly interrupt, a narrative or a flow or anything like that. So feel free, drop them in, and we can chat about them in there. So, well, first, thanks, Ronan and Jean, for running.
Let me change what we said in a tiny fix. You can use the chat for discussion, even if not totally relevant to this session. I will filter the chat and ping Andy when we have a question to him, but use the chat for discussions and questions.
Sounds good. Yeah, probably prefix everything with a Q. It kind of, makes it a lot easier to pick out the chat versus the questions. No, thank you. Yeah, so thanks, Ronan and Jean, for running the the data-driven community. I mean, I think I've known Jean now for for about 2 or 3 years, and yeah, I mean, Kevin's up next week talking about Data Explorer. I'll probably definitely join in for that session as well, so that's really good. But thank you all for joining for this session around Synapse Analytics, my favorite topic. It's probably what I speak about and blog about the most. This session has no technical demos in it at all. It's a bit of a step back, just composing ourselves a little bit before we start jumping into technology and start creating resources and loading data and all that good stuff, where we're going to just have a little look and see if we're implementing Synapse Analytics, or we're looking to implement Synapse Analytics. One of the ways in which you do that is, a proof of concept. Proof of concepts are not, necessarily directly linked just to Synapse Analytics. Anything in life can have a proof of concept. So what we'll do is let me just click on PowerPoint so I can click through. So a little bit about me. So that QR code takes you to Twitter. That's the platform that I'm most active on when it comes to conversations. Yeah, so I always enjoy a conversation on Synapse, other cloud data warehousing products, Databricks, Snowflake, whatever. Data modeling, I always love a good conversation around star schemas and data vaults, OBTs, that sort of thing. I mostly blog at serverlesssql.com. So that's really my Synapse Analytics focused blog. Do a lot of stuff on serverless, some stuff on dedicated. Power BI integration with Synapse Analytics is quite a big topic that I work on. And in the bottom left, you'll see data toboggan. So as Ronan, mentioned briefly, I'm part of an organizing team for a Synapse Analytics focused conference and some associated technology. So if there's, some machine learning or some Power BI that's relevant to the Synapse universe, we cover that as well. But it is very, very focused on Synapse. So datatoboggan.co.uk. If you go to the website, we've got our next event, which is happening on Saturday, June the is it June the 24th? So towards the end of June, where we'll probably have 2 tracks all about Synapse Analytics and associated technology. So please check that out. So really, we're only going to cover 2 topics. The bulk is going to be this second topic, which is the success by design and the proof of concept playbooks. But we're just going to take a step back and look at proof of concepts generally. What are we trying to do with them, and what actually are they? Because when we're running a project, we want to make sure that we've got the things in place that we need to make that project succeed. With the proof of concept, what we can do is we can start a very, very small project, get the relevant pieces in place, complete that project, and we'll talk about what completion and success means in a bit. And hopefully we'll have an outcome. Then that success by design and the proof of concept playbooks, these have been created by Microsoft to help you evaluate Synapse services. Yeah. So not just Synapse as a whole, but particular services within Synapse to meet a particular workload that you want to implement. So those are the 2 things that we're going to look at. So really what kicked this off is a quote. So Matthew Adams from Engine, so his business partner Howard, we were discussing proof of concepts and what they meant, what they are, what we're looking to do and achieve with them. And Howard sent me this article. So it's in the references section of the PowerPoint. So I'll make it available as a PDF so you can download it. And there'll be links, links to all of the resources that I cover in this session, but also the blog posts that I've got some reference data. And this kind of hit home to me, this quote from Matthew, which is, a POC is not a quick hack. And the reason it resonated with me is that I have in the past treated a small proof of concept as just hacking something together. Let's get something working so that we can show people, and then those people will say, oh my word, that's amazing. Let's turn that into a fully fledged project. Sometimes that's happened, and sometimes it's gone wrong because I've not given the proof of concept the respect that it deserves. I've not put in place the steps that are required to get that proof of concept completed. So when you're looking to do a proof of concept, it isn't a skunk works project. It is a project. Yeah. A proof of concept is a project that needs steps from the beginning to the end to complete. And you can validate those steps as you go along. Now, I couldn't necessarily have proof of concept without putting the dictionary definition in there. So what are we looking to do when we create a proof of concept? Well, we want to demonstrate something. Yeah, so we want to demonstrate that a service or some software or a process or code, a set of business rules, whatever. We want to demonstrate that that is doable, that we can put this in place and it will work to a desired outcome. Now, we may not know that at the beginning. Yes, if we drill into specifics and we start talking about proof of concepts of data products, we might look at benchmarks. We might look at the data integration points and the services that those data products support and the platforms that they support. So we can funnel down what may or may not work in our environment and may or may not work in terms of any SLAs, but we're still looking to demonstrate if something is feasible. Yeah, so we're going to go through a series of steps. We're going to complete a project, and afterwards we'll say, yes, it's feasible, or no, it's not. Now, in terms of a proof of concept, when we look at engaging in a POC with Synapse Analytics, we do have to set requirements. We do have to set goals and tests to be able to validate, have we met the goals that this proof of concept, that we created this proof of concept for. So one of the most important things, defining the goals. Now, this is a step that we'll discuss in the proof of concept, in the success by design playbooks later on. But ultimately, we've got to define the goals to assess the outcome of the proof of concept. Now, I created a poll. I don't create too many polls on Twitter, to be honest with you, but I was genuinely interested what people thought success meant in a proof of concept. So if someone were to pass you in the corridor or the virtual corridor and said, hey, I heard you did a proof of concept. How did it go? How will you answer? What I mean by that is I asked two questions. I said, if I say a proof of concept succeeds, is it because it works? So in Synapse Analytics, if we set up a Synapse Analytics workspace and we've done what's required to complete the proof of concept, and it's worked, it's succeeded, the data's loaded in the time that we wanted it to load in, and it's visible in the format that we want it to be visible in, it's been a success. Most people picked number two, which is the one that I agree with, which is you're trying to prove whether something works or does not work. You want an outcome. So a scientist in a laboratory, at the end of the experiment, for the experiment to have been a success, they have to have an outcome. If halfway through the experiment, someone drops the test tube on the floor, I mean, they might have to run out of the building if it's particularly noxious chemicals or something dangerous, but they won't have been able to complete the experiment. They won't have an outcome. So that made me happy. Yep. So when people are talking about the success of a proof of concept, it's we got an outcome. Now, it's perfectly feasible to have finished a proof of concept with Synapse Analytics or any platform, finished the project, and then at the very end, got the outcome. It didn't work. It did not work for us. Now, of course, you know, you could go back, revisit that proof of concept because maybe you needed to tweak something. However, you've still got an outcome. Yeah.
May I interrupt you with mention one terms?
Ronan, go for it.
I think that there is a big confusion between the goals or the goal and the objectives, which is what we actually can measure. So this is important to understand.
So in that case, what were the differences between the goals and the objectives? Or was it just a case of being able to identify what's a goal and what's an objective?
Basically, the goal is what you want to get to at the end, but what you measure, it's the objectives.
Yes. Yeah, good point.
So
Good point.
the process that you speak about, you define the goals in order to assess the objectives. You
Mm.
need goal and you need objectives, which is something that it is measurable. You
With
can
a
measure.
test. Yeah, that's a very good point. So the tests can feed into the goals, which can feed into the objectives. Okay, so if we're looking at where a proof of concept sits in the whole development life cycle of, a product or a service, we can say, and I can say with reasonable certainty, that it's not an isolated piece of work. It can exist in the pipeline in a stage in the development process, because if that proof of concept is a success and you want to carry on with that proof of concept and expand it, you're not just going to throw it away and start again. Even if you did destroy all resources and rebuild it, you're still going to have some form of templating, some form of process to recreate what you've done, but it can exist as a stage, in the development process. So you get your initial version working, your initial proof of concept working, then you could maybe move it on to an MVP, a minimum viable product. The POC is not the thing that you'd want to go live with. That's just the thing that you're using to test your concepts. And as Ronan said, if you've got some overall objectives and you've got some goals and some tests to assess those goals, you'll want to complete that first, get those done, and then you could turn it into an MVP, a minimum viable product. It's an expanded, it's an improved version of your proof of concept with, let's say, all the bells and whistles that you may want attached. And I don't want to call things like security bells and whistles, but in your proof of concept, you might have some core concepts. Your minimum viable product is about how you would take that and implement it in your organization in production, which is a whole another set of processes. But ultimately, they're not separate. Each one can lead into the other, or rather, the proof of concept can lead into the minimum viable product. Now, when we talk about scope, it can often be the toughest part of the proof of concept stage, especially if you're dealing with something like Synapse, where you don't ever want to treat Synapse as a solution looking for a problem. It needs to be the other way around. Because of the different services, the different data processing technologies that are available within Synapse, it should be the other way around, which is we have this workload, a traditional data warehousing workload, a streaming analytics workload, a data lakehouse workload, whatever that workload, you're coming in from the requirement side into the services that can meet those requirements. But of course, with Synapse, yes, we have quite a lot of features and services within there. So what we want to do is we want to cherry pick the services and the features that are relevant to the proof of concept that we're working on. I know that might sound obvious, but you can get a bit carried away because we've got serverless SQL pools that can talk to data lake data. Great. We've got some data lake stuff. Let's throw in some serverless SQL pools. We've got to administrate the platform. Yeah, we've got user permissions, right? Dedicated SQL pools for large scale data warehousing. Hey, look, there's Spark pools as well. Maybe we need to process data. So let's chuck in some Spark pools. We've got to load our data. There's network security. How are we encrypting our data, whether it's in dedicated, whether it's in a data lake, querying the data? You start to see, yeah, we're building up a ton of different aspects of Synapse. Yeah, so it's entirely possible to get lost in a big POC because you've got all these services to choose from in terms of what you want that solution to be at the end. So we can create multiple proof of concepts So this has worked for me in the past because when we talk about scope, people can get a little bit panicky and think, well, if that's not in scope, that's something that we do need to deal with, or that does really need to be in the scope because it's going to be part of the overall project. And then you get scope creep and it starts to bloat and become bigger and unmanageable. And that's the last thing that you want your proof of concept to become, is unmanageable, because it's collapsing under the weight of everything that you want to test with. So what we can do is we can chain the proof of concepts together. One proof of concept must succeed before the next one triggers. Succeed in terms of, yes, you were able to complete that proof of concept, and the outcome was that, yes, it's meeting your requirements. Let's move on to the next proof of concept. And we can just group what we want together into areas of interest. So for example, POC 1, you're evaluating large scale data warehousing. You've identified dedicated SQL pools, and to be honest with you, two of the most important things in dedicated SQL pools is loading the data, in brackets, table distributions, loading patterns, etc. I won't go into that too much. We won't dive too much into the technical aspects. And then querying the data, how you're going to get the data back out of the system. So with dedicated, it is a considered process in terms of loading data and in terms of querying data. But we haven't spoken at all about anything to do with serverless SQL pools. So someone might pop up and say, well, hey, by the way, if in this data warehousing analytics system that you're implementing with Synapse, we do have third parties that can extract data directly into an Azure data lake. What do we want to do with that? Well, maybe we want to do some ad hoc analysis on it, some logical data warehousing. We've got some serverless SQL pools there as well. Separate POC. Yeah, not something to be bolted into POC 1 when we've got dedicated SQL pools to worry about. And then the last one could be network security and user permissions. Do we have the granularity of permissions that we require? Now, POC 3 could actually swap over and be the first one you do. The feasibility of the platform. Are you able to lock it down to what, to the level that you need it locked, that your organization is legally responsible for locking data down into? Do you have the granularity and flexibility of user permissions to meet your particular permissions model? But we can chain them together. Yeah, one follows one after the other. I guess it really comes down to being realistic. So if you're approaching Synapse Analytics, and there are lots of services, as I've covered, don't over egg the pudding. Keep it simple with just a service and a couple of features and an outcome that you want to be able to measure. Now, when it comes to materials supplied by Microsoft themselves, because obviously you can go out to Microsoft and you can engage Microsoft and say, hey, we want an account manager to help us with our Synapse Analytics journey, and we want one of your customer success engineers to come on site and help us with our data platform strategy in terms of Synapse Analytics. But we've got some documentation that we can use. And in fact, you can actually use this documentation to potentially validate what someone else is implementing for you. So a consultancy. If a consultancy is implementing a Synapse project, then you may be armed with some necessary information to be able to validate what you're doing. Or you're doing this yourself. So you want not necessarily Microsoft to hold your hand, but just to guide you in the right direction in certain areas. So As I said, I've got the reference slide with all the links to all of this. And in fact, if you just type into Google or Bing, Synapse Analytics Success by Design, then you're going to find the documentation, which is within the general Synapse Analytics documentation itself. It used to exist on GitHub in downloadable PDF form before they took it and incorporated it with the Synapse Analytics documentation itself, which is far more useful and integrated. But essentially, I've mentioned the CSE team before, the masters of their craft when it comes to implementing Synapse Analytics. And this comes from projects that they've run out in the field with clients. So lessons learned, helping you do things the right way. And firstly, we've got the playbooks. So we've got the Azure Synapse proof of concept playbook. So we'll look at what playbooks are available, and then we'll just concentrate on one of the playbooks for the rest of the sessions, which will be on dedicated. But they also have the Synapse implementation success by design. Okay, now we'll be looking at the playbooks for the rest of the session, but basically the differences are that the playbooks are the step-by-step guides on what you want to do, or what you may want to do when you're setting up your proof of concept. The implementation success by design is all about validating what you're doing. So actually, you can use them independently. You can use the playbooks to set up and carry out your proof of concept, and then validate it using the success by design, or just use the success by design and validate another implementation. So that's the differences. The playbooks are like the actual, is how you do it, and the implementation success by design is validating what you're doing. So in terms of the playbooks themselves, they have updated the playbooks very recently. So we now have 4 playbooks available. So we've got dedicated SQL pools. So what the documentation is guiding you through is the areas in which you need, if you're looking to set up data warehousing workloads within a relational database, within a large MPP system, which is what dedicated SQL pools is. So it'll go through data loading patterns and and querying. So everything that's relevant to dedicated SQL pools. Then they'll have serverless SQL pools. So Microsoft's use cases for serverless covers 3 areas. You've got ad hoc analysis of data in the data lake, or data exported from source systems into the data lake. So for example, products like Synapse Link, where you can synchronize data from the Dataverse, so Dynamics or SQL Server or Azure SQL Database, and synchronize that into the data lake, and then explore that data. But you've also got the opportunity to cast structure over that data and do some logical data warehousing, where if you do not want to take data and then do more transformation with it and land it somewhere else where you can just analyze it in the data lake, you can do that with serverless SQL pools. So it talks about how you do that. And then Spark pools, so big data processing workloads. So if you're working a lot with the Delta format, for example, Spark pools are your friends there. So again, it's assessing the steps that you need when implementing Spark workloads within Synapse. And then the new one is Data Explorer, ADX, or Data Explorer pools within Synapse, where It's looking at guiding you through real-time data streaming, which is what Data Explorer is for. So analyzing, data over time periods, over windowing periods, a little bit like streaming analytics in terms of aggregating data that's flowing through a pipeline and visualizing that data. So using a language called KQL. So the Data Explorer is actually the most recent one that they've added there as well. So we've got 4 playbooks to look at. So you'll notice there's no playbooks for Synapse pipelines or Power BI integration. Power BI implementation, even though you can integrate Power BI within Synapse Analytics, add workspaces, Power BI workspaces into Synapse Studio and author data sets and build reports within Synapse Studio itself. It's not really the place where you would want to do any form of playbooks around Power BI. That has its own area completely. Melissa Coates does an awful lot around the implementation of Power BI with Microsoft. Those articles are definitely worth checking out. There's nothing to do with that. Pipelines, in fact, is a component that's added into playbooks. So you may want to load data into dedicated using pipelines, or take data from its source into a data lake for serverless using pipelines. So pipelines doesn't really have its own playbook. It's I don't want to say a supporting service because that's doing it a disservice, but if you see what I mean, it can be used across dedicated, serverless, and Spark pools. So I'll touch on this briefly, which is the success by design. So when I compare the differences between the proof of concept playbook and the success by design documents, are that the playbooks are, hey, this is what you might want to do and the steps you might want to take when implementing your Synapse project. The success by design is how you're validating. So the evaluation steps. So we've got a few evaluation steps there. So we've got the overall Synapse workspace analysis. So has the Synapse workspace been set up to meet the requirements? Have the data loading patterns been created with, well, number one, recommended practices, dependent on what workload you're using, dedicated serverless, Spark, Data Explorer, etc. SQL pools design, so how you've created your tables. In dedicated, how you've distributed your data in those tables. In serverless, it might be how you've created partition views. Spark pools workload evaluation. So are you using libraries within your Spark clusters to better enhance your workloads? Have you set up the executions of your Spark workbooks in the best way? The environment planning is set up is really about the general Azure environment itself, because you're going to need an Azure subscription to create Synapse Analytics in. So this will be all about the architecture of your Azure infrastructure. So the workspaces that are not the workspaces, the resource groups that have been set up. Yeah, so the kind of the overall environment. Evaluating a project plan. So when we've set up this proof of concept and we want to go through this project step by step, are we making sure that it makes sense? Are we making sure that it's achievable? So we'll go through that project plan. Team skills. So I'm not saying that you have to call Microsoft every time that you want to do a project, but you need the right skill sets. So whether you've identified, certain team members with skills, or you need to upskill / cross skill, or you need to bring some external skills in. However you do it, evaluate to make sure you've got the right skills for the project. Operational readiness. This is all really about monitoring, administration, and governance of the system. You know, do you have those, or can you have those in place within your organization? And then user training and monitoring review as well. But they're all about evaluating what you're doing. And that's actually quite involved. Yes, it's quite a big document in terms of what you're doing for each of those aspects. And of course, you can do any of those in any order as well, or just cherry pick the ones that you want to evaluate. So in terms of the proof of concept playbook itself with dedicated SQL pools, so when we're preparing for the POC, so this is before we execute the POC, we need to go through some steps. So we need to identify the sponsors. So I'm going to go through a series of steps here that I know people want to jump in and start using the technology and creating the solution. However, we do need those champions within the business that are going to speak on our behalf as the technologists to champion what we're doing. That could be anyone within the organization with the authority to do so, obviously. Do we have any blockers? Could be political, could be skill sets, it could be technical challenges. Yeah, we got to identify anything that is going to stop our Synapse POC from progressing. So that could be a central IT department's time in terms of setting an environment up or providing you with a playground with which you can carry on your playbook, but you have to identify anything that's going to stop you from doing that proof of concept. I'll put in brackets pain points because ultimately, if you're implementing Synapse, you're not doing it just for the sake of doing it. You're doing it because either you've spotted an opportunity to use it or you're solving a problem. I'll leave it up to you to decide what that opportunity is and what that problem is, but we need our use cases. So if someone says, the age-old question of why, and you're excitedly talking about your Synapse Analytics project and someone stops you and says, why? What are you doing it for? Bang, you've got your answers. Creating a high-level architecture. And again, these steps can be done in any relevant order for your organization or the project that you're running. But creating a high-level architecture, yes, that's our Azure subscription. Yeah, that's the tenant that subscription is attached to. That's how the resource groups have been created. Yeah, how are we talking to setting up and talking to our storage accounts? Yeah, so it's putting those pieces together in an architectural diagram. Then we've got to work with some data. Now, the chances are it's a proof of concept and you're not going to be working with all of the data within your organization. But yeah, identify a data set. Now, that could be from the sponsor. Yeah, so it could be it could be the chief marketing officer who really wants to use all that telemetry data to be able to target advertising to. Well, there's your sponsor, and they've probably got some data for you as well. Yeah, but you've got to identify what data you're going to use for your proof of concept. It's probably no good using the AdventureWorks. You could probably test the technical aspects, but none of the relevance in the organizational context. Then in terms of migration considerations, now what we mean by this is when you're implementing your proof of concept, it could be a total greenfield project, it could be something completely new, or it could be something that you're looking to migrate away from. So if it's, let's say, an typical on-premise platform, then you might want to consider migrating certain aspects. So perhaps some of the ETL patterns that you're looking to migrate away from. Could you just, sorry about this, could you just give me 30 seconds? Because I've got my children, I'm just hearing an issue. So I'm going to be back in 30 seconds, Ronan. Hang on.
Yeah, no problem. Well, we will use this 30 minutes to remind you. Use the chat. Ask question if you have. We have a question from Mandania. I think that I pronounced it so well. Will we be able to download the presentation? Yes, probably. We record this meeting like all the meeting, and we put the presentation and all the session materials from the speakers available to download. The only reason I'm saying probably is because I don't like to promise anything. It's technical word, but this is the plan. And let me share the screen.
Hello.
Yeah, Andy is back.
It was a toast burning incident.
So, that's okay. This is the fun of a live meeting. You never know what happened.
Especially with children. Especially with children. So anyway, yes, the migration considerations. So we don't necessarily want to reinvent the wheel. So we may want to do something like some data processing in the original system, and then taking that data and bulk loading it into our destination, whether it's dedicated SQL pools or it's the data lake, because ultimately we may not have time to rewrite loading processes to suit the proof of concept that we're working to. So again, this is about being realistic about what you can migrate into your new solution. Now we come to the goals and the success criteria. So we need to set some goals. We need to define some success criteria in all of this. Now, again, be realistic. Keep to a handful of goals that you can measure. Because after that, we're going to create a testing plan, because we need to link a test to a goal. So it could be the speed in which we're loading a particular piece of data. It could be the speed in which we're retrieving a particular data set. We need to assign a test to a goal. And then set some timelines. Now, in proof of concepts, we do want to keep these, as short as possible, because the longer the proof of concept goes on, it may drift, things may change, the goals may change. We're not going to get to the end. The likelihood is we're not going to get to the end of our proof of concept and get a satisfactory outcome. And assemble a team. Yeah. Get your Synapse Avengers together in terms of who is going to be doing this proof of concept and responsible as well. So we could have a project manager, we could have a data engineer, we could have a DevOps person. Yeah, so assembling the team relevant to that. And again, you can do any of these in the relevant order for your organization. So for example, you might want to do the use cases first, because everything else is totally irrelevant if you can't answer the question of why. Why are you implementing Synapse Analytics in the first place? Which is the first question, really. So in terms of the playbook itself, so when we want to put this into practice, again, we've got a series of steps that we want to go through. The first of which being setup. Now, actually, setup could be its own proof of concept itself. So if we're looking at setting up a Synapse workspace, that could be a completely separate proof of concept, because the success criteria of that proof of concept will be we've set up the Synapse workspace as per our requirements, and the relevant people can connect to it, and the relevant people can develop for it, and the relevant people can run the code or load the data or query the data. Then we move into other proof of concepts like working with dedicated or serverless. But we want to look at data loading. So if we're looking at dedicated SQL pools, there are different ways of loading data within dedicated SQL pools. There are some recommended ways of loading data, such as using the copy into for as much parallelism as possible. Let me go into, so we want to look at how we're distributing the tables within dedicated SQL pools to meet the data loading requirements and meet the querying requirements as well. And then we get down to our querying tests. Now, I think I've got, I'll bring these both up at the same time. So sequential query tests and concurrent query tests. So with dedicated, we've got one of, I think, is its best feature, which is workload isolation. So with a single dedicated SQL pool, you can actually turn it into a multiple cluster environment by setting workload isolation on. So for example, if you had a dedicated SQL pool that had 600 gig of RAM, you could isolate certain workloads so that only, let's say, 300 gig of RAM was dedicated to data loading, 200 gig of RAM was dedicated to ad hoc querying, and the other 100 gig of RAM was dedicated to Power BI data flow and data set loading, for example. But when we're running our dedicated SQL pool, we're running at a specific tier, which will give us a certain number of queries that we can run at the same time. So our sequential and concurrent query tests, we can use software like Apache JMeter, which can fire off sequential and concurrent queries at a SQL source. So we're going to want to set up relevant queries. So that big query that generates that big data set that you need, get that in a query test. And then mixed workload tests. So when we're running both data loading processes, which is getting data into dedicated, and then we're running processes to retrieve data from dedicated, we want to be doing mixed workload tests as well. Now, workload isolation, can play a role here so that you can isolate, the required resources for your data loading and your querying. And then optimizing the data. So optimizing the data and data loading might go hand in hand here, because you might have identified a table distribution process in dedicated. You might have identified a data loading pattern, and then you've gone through your data loading processes, and then you've come back to this optimizing the data where you've identified that actually, yes, you could maybe distribute that data slightly differently, load that data, transform it slightly differently, essentially kind of, a little bit of optimization there in the process. And then value-added tests. Well, really with value-added tests, it could be around user access and user permissions or security, those things that, well, as it suggests, adds value to the proof of concept. So really, to recap, we're going to set up our dedicated SQL pools in our Synapse workspace. We're going to go through the process of creating tables with distribution properties. We're going to load our data into those tables. We're then going to query those tables either sequentially and concurrently as well, so we can see what's happening when queries are being issued against the dedicated SQL pool. We'll do the data loading and the querying together in our mixed workload, and then we may look at some optimization as well if we've identified it during the proof of concept. So putting the proof of concept into practice, like I said, we're going to go through the process of creating and configuring the Synapse workspace. We're going to be creating our dedicated SQL pool, and creating that dedicated SQL pool at the tier in which we can run a successful proof of concept, the likelihood is you're going to be running that dedicated SQL pool at a small DWU tier before scaling up. But you're going to create that dedicated SQL pool, create the tables necessary, and then you can load the data into the dedicated SQL pool. So again, the playbook's going to go through processes in which you can do that, usually using the copy into command, which is going to give you the most parallelism when you're copying your bulk loading data from a source into dedicated. And with dedicated, we're using very much an ELT pattern where we've extracted the data, let's say using Synapse pipelines, and then we've loaded the data into dedicated, and then we're transforming the data within dedicated. We're basically using what dedicated is for, which is large scale data processing. Run some queries. Yeah, it's no good getting data in if we can't get the data out. And then, we need to document our query runtimes. Now, they may be the basis of the tests that then feed into the goals, because, well, there probably wouldn't be much point creating this if this new solution loaded a lot slower than the old solution. There might be some good reasons why, but I could probably say that with 100% certainty that people will want to see that this is loading faster and querying faster than their old systems. So I talked about timelines. So yeah, keep it short, which means then you could be disciplined with the chaining together of your proof of concepts. The first proof of concept is about the feasibility of setting up the workspace and networking and security, because if you can't get it locked down to how you want it locked down or how you need it locked down, there's no point loading any data, because what's the point? You haven't gone past that first proof of concept. So really 2 weeks, kind of finger in the air in terms of a timeline, which means that you have to have the proof of concept project plan in place before you start this 2-week timeline, and not try and do it, during. So if you need a Synapse workspace to test your dedicated SQL pools, that's probably worthwhile being set up beforehand and ready to go. Yeah, so there we go. Setup of the environment not included in the proof of concept timeline unless the setup is the proof of concept. So again, excuse me, rough estimates, we may want to spend 3 days loading our data in, trying different ways of loading the data in. You might want to spend 5 days querying the data, because that could include feeding some downstream machine learning models. It could be feeding Power BI resources, data flows, data sets, whatever you need further downstream, and then documenting and validating it. Yeah, so we're going to document our, we should have been documenting our data loading volumes and speeds as we've gone along, so that then we can validate those towards, we can validate those at the end against our goals. So really, that's what I wanted to cover in the proof of concept. It's a really good resource, the proof of concept playbooks and the success by designs. You can learn quite a lot about some real world implementations by going through those documentations, going through the documentation on those aspects, and it'll give you a boundary, really. Yeah, it'll help you focus on the key points that you want to get done to get a proof of concept up and running. So yeah, I'm going to put my screen on at the end. Yeah, like I said, Twitter, that's where I do most of my socials. So feel free, have a chat to me about Synapse, about data warehousing in general, because yeah, I really love a conversation about that. But yeah, there we go. Thank you very much, Ronan, for having me. And thank you
very
everyone
much
for listening.
Thank you very much. It's an awesome session. And after the session, please send Jen the presentation and all the social materials that you want. So we will publish it together with the recording of the session.
Yes. Yes, I'll push. So yeah, if you make a note of my Twitter, Mr. Andy Cutler, I'll push out a PDF of this session because yeah, as I said, if I click through, then there you go. So, or where I got the definitions for proof of concept, and the success by design documentation from Microsoft. If you get a bit stuck with it or you're not quite sure what anything means, just like I said, ask me a question on Twitter. More than happy to answer.
Okay, thanks a lot. So I want to thank the speakers for today again, and to everyone who joined us to this meeting. Please remember to follow the website and our meetup for our next meetings. And don't forget, the Future Data Driven Summit is already open for speakers that want to register and for people that want to participate. So we'll see you next week. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Andy.
Thank you. See you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.